to Ms. Elisa Hategan, coming all the way from Toronto, Canada, and also our other panelists, Rabbi Weiss, Dr. Tony Brown, and Dr. Veronica LaBove.
Shannon.
We appreciate you for coming tonight and engaging in this critical conversation. First, we'll hear from Elisa, who would talk about her process in becoming reformed and de-radicalized. Then we will open up for an interactive panel discussion in which we will invite the other panelists to discuss some critical questions about white supremacy and how we can tackle the problem. We encourage you to ask questions. I will post a phone number for you to text questions in the audience that you would like to be asked. At the very end of the presentation, we will show you a toolkit, which is the culmination of our project group's research and what we describe as the tangible solutions that all of you can walk away with today as ways to combat white supremacy in your daily lives. Before Elisa's presentation begins, I would like to explain why we are working on this project. Our group came together in Associate 309 class, the very first week of classes, and it is taught by Dr. Craig Constantine, who's here with us today as well. We recognize that white supremacy is not a relic of a racialized past in this country, but it's part of an insidious, pervasive force in this country that continues to this day and poses future dangers as well. No longer are the ideals of white supremacy confined to the notion of the traditional racist. From the local coffee shop goers to the internet trolls online, white supremacists are a part of our society in private spaces and cyberspace as well. Radicalization of white Americans has become endemic in our country, and for this reason, they've taken to the streets of college towns like Charlottesville, Murfreesboro, and before it was abruptly canceled, College Station, just a couple miles north of us. With the recent rise of white supremacy, it is important that communities like the Rice community, like the Houston community, and us as all American citizens work together to prevent the spread of radicalization. We want to conduct this project to create a dialogue about this issue and also walk away with serious, tangible solutions that we can all do something about this the second we step out of this room. Through our research, we came across Elisa and the great work she has done. We quickly reached out to her as we thought she would be the ideal person to come out here and talk about her process of reformation and also provide real solutions to the problem. From there, our event developed. In organizing this event, we had 3 key motivators that we wanted to follow up on, 3 key actions: promoting social justice, engaging in allyship, and fighting oppression. By fighting the spread of radicalization through the lens of these motivating ideas, we were working to create a more equitable society for all of us here in Rice, for all of us in Houston, for all of us in this country. A key realization of our team's research is that white supremacy is not a minority problem. It is a problem for all of us in our society. Heather Heyer was not a minority, yet she was the subject of violence at the hands of white supremacy. This unfortunate tragedy highlights this event, and I think all of us here can appreciate the notion that is a wake-up call to all of us in America to really think critically about a problem that we thought may have been eliminated in the past, the civil rights era, that still remains today. I would like to hand it over to Elisa. Elisa is an author, an activist, a speaker, a journalist, and the regional coordinator for Central Canada in the United States of Against Violent Extremism, a global network of allies, former radicalized individuals, and other people who are affected by such violence, working together to stop radicalization, specifically for white supremacy. We are so happy that Elisa came all the way down from Toronto, so please give her a big hand. Thank you very much.
That hate groups, like many groups, will target what they feel is the most powerful, right? Who could lead to the most potential. Therefore, it would seem that college campuses, particularly campuses which will lead to incredibly successful alumni, right? Who not only can provide power within the community itself, but to make connections that would be lucrative in multiple ways when people manage to graduate. So yes, I absolutely think that college campuses would be a smart place for anyone to target. I mean, think about it. If you're in an organization right now, how many times does the organization say, hey, when you graduate, you get all that money, don't forget about us, right? So why wouldn't hate groups do the same thing?
Yeah, I think another virtue of university environments is simply the open tent and the broad acceptance of so many different viewpoints and the range of possibilities of discussions. And so having those kind of conversations with the university population makes sense. People are open to different types of views, and sometimes they don't yet have their own views solidified in their own mind, and so things can seem very reasonable.
And I would add to that I think university campuses provide free publicity for some people. Certainly the way folks react when people come to campuses creates more, I guess, attention for these people who are likely to try to recruit folks. And then some universities have been very careful about free speech, and some have been more open about free speech, and I think that is the type of environment that allows folks to think about this is how we can get our message out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Moving on, what do you see as the biggest challenge for encouraging critical conversations and open dialogue between young people on college campuses?
Same order or different order?
Yeah.
You know, I'll start. I think it's really all about making connections with people. And, you know, when you can make a connection with another person, you can have that kind of open conversation. And I think that's one of the things that's certainly missing in society today, it seems, is the kind of situations where you can talk with other people, not shout, not necessarily disagree, but to talk. I think one of the things to remember is that we're not really interested so much in people being comfortable, but certainly being safe. Being safe means, you know, you're physically safe, that you feel like you can say things, like you can engage with other people. That doesn't mean that you have to be comfortable in terms of the things that you hear from other people.
I think that's a great point. In order for people to have the kinds of conversations I think we all want to have, you have to be uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And many of you have found this rice bubble to be very comfortable. So comfortable you've never ever pushed outside boundaries that have been formed during O Week. So we have to find ways to upset things while still keeping you safe.
And I think that the spiral of silence that we have is really, it's a real thing, right? We think that we're going to be rejected when we say something, so we don't say it. The more we think people will accept it, the more likely we are to say it. So the idea that we will be branded a certain way, or there's a fragility that comes with really putting ourselves out there with how we honestly feel, will have us avoid these particular conversations. Because it's not just about being uncomfortable. I think part of it comes from being labeled or feel like we're going to be labeled if we participate honestly in some of these conversations. So I think that part of the safety is an open acceptance of let's really talk about how we feel here so that we can get a sense of understanding from someone who has a different perspective than we do without holding it against them later on, right? Without having those little side comments like, well, that's not what you said yesterday. You know, when I asked you that question, that racist much? You know, like you cannot have like those labels or those tags that come with honest sharing.
Absolutely. And the thing is, the safe space also extends to the white supremacists. A lot of times, if they feel like they can't, whatever starts out as a small a grievance or whatever they think, and it might be wrong, and it might be as easy as having a conversation with someone and clearing it up in a non-violent and peaceful way. But if they feel that they can't say it, they're going to search for a safe space for racists to say it, which will be in some forum where they're going to be fed. It'll become an echo chamber of people who agree with them. The point is you want to have those people feel comfortable enough that they can ask a question. It might not be a statement, but just ask a question that they feel is politically correct. But if they don't ask it and we don't answer it correctly, that's where the problem can happen.
And can I tag in on that a little bit? Also realize that words can be a form of violence, right? Like, so this doesn't mean the creation of a safe space is an easy thing, right? Like, this doesn't mean when you start that conversation, you can't just let other people feel a certain kind of way. Like, you have to make sure that you're in a healthy mental place to have those conversations as well. Otherwise, that will be part of the de-evolution. If I'm feeling angry about something and I really want to talk it out, do I really want to talk it out and get real answers? Or am I looking for some way to get justice from someone else, right? Like, so you have to make sure that if we're really talking about these conversations, it has to come from a place of openness and willingness to recognize your own positionality when you have them.
But you know, there are even more barriers than that. Just the barrier of we all want to be liked. And if you want to be liked, all of these other things sometimes don't even come into play because you want to have other people agree with you, or you want to agree with them, you want to be part of the group. Maybe it never even gets to some of those conversations.
Yeah.
So are there any like specific social or political factors in this day and age that are different from previous ages that impact those critical conversations?
Yeah.
Social media.
There was a great editorial by a student affairs professional at a university in the Northeast, I think it was, that talked about how the problem today with social media is that people aren't allowed to make mistakes. And in this editorial, he talked about how he was arrested for doing graffiti on a McDonald's, and he spent the night in jail, and the only people that knew were really his friend who did it with him and his parents. You do that today, and everybody hears, and it's with you for the rest of your life. People aren't allowed to make mistakes.
Absolutely. Even when you think conversations are private, let's take a little informal poll. Y'all ready? How many of you have gotten a text message conversation, you took a screenshot of it, and you sent it to somebody else because you really wanted that somebody else to believe, come on, be high, raise them high. You really wanted somebody else to believe what was said. And it was never about something positive, like they never liked your shoes or your hair, right? It's that someone said something really crappy and you were like, look what such and such said, right? So it's not even just the media front, the social media front, it's that there is not the privacy, right? Or an expectation of privacy. And that makes a lot of care in what people decide to say. Like back in the day, if we wanted to have a conversation and we had a good argument, it probably wouldn't have been by text. It probably would have been face-to-face. Doors may have been slammed. Some people heard some of the stuff, but nobody would really be able to repeat it, right? So it would be seen as different perspectives. So I think that lack of privacy that comes with a lot of things these days also impacts
and that's
that.
to this group thing, right? Because you respond sometimes in the way you think your friends are going to approve, rather than, so if you meet some racists, like you could try to like debate or try to argue with them, but then your friends will be like, oh, you should just tell them to go F them, and then you respond in a socially prescribed way and the other way around. So it's kind of like, what will give me more likes on Facebook, like I did this or that. So that's also a huge influence, no matter what side you fall on.
And I think something else that's changed and we don't really account for it is racism. So it was really easy to identify people wearing white sheets with eye holes and figure out exactly what your right perspective is or the moral perspective is. But when racism is colorblind, when people are online expressing their views and not in the streets expressing their views, then it becomes much harder for us to identify what is the right course to take, who's for this, who's not for that. And I think another thing that's happened is, and it may be due to social media, no one thinks they're racist.
But other people are.
I'm not racist, but he is.
Well, even the nature of racism, like the idea of microaggressions versus outright aggressions, right, make us question whether there's even been something racist that happened. I was in Portland this weekend, which was formerly known as a whitescape, right? So I walk into a Safeway, and suddenly I have small children staring at me, right? Because some of them had never seen a brown person in that particular neighborhood who looked like me. Because as Creole, I do have mixed race heritage. Some, I was outright hostility as I was walking to get snacks, right? Like, I'm just buying peanuts, people, right? So I had a question of, am I paranoid that I'm having people stare at me outright? Like, is this me making a racial assumption about where I am? Or is this truly microaggressive behavior as people are now following me around the store to see what I put in my basket, right? So I think those questions of, am I being crazy? Is this really even a racist thing? It's kind of what helps to underlie a lot of what racism is in a contemporary storefront. Like if someone would have knocked something out of my hand, I'd be like, woo, racist, But as it happened, it makes it hard to delineate,
So how can social media be used to build bridges of understanding?
As a tool to get people together to talk in a civil manner. How's that?
Oh, that always happens on social media.
I mean, all the
discussions are so civil.
Can we have another poll? How many of you have been a whole lot more hostile because you figured out people wouldn't feel who you were? Like you've never met this person in your life. Could be a professor that you just put on blast online. Could be something that you saw you thought the person would never see. But whereas normally you would blow it off online, you're like, I cannot believe this happened. Y'all, I did it the other day. Somebody parked too close. I took a picture of the car parked next to me where I couldn't get in. And I was like, do y'all see this crap? And then suddenly like everybody's blowing it up. And we do it all the time, right? So how do we switch a place to kind of ease our aggressions into something that makes us relax and become more positive, right? And I don't know what the easy answer is. I mean, perhaps it's putting likes on things that are positive versus negative, right? Maybe changing what we decide to react to. Because if we think about it, how many of us react to things that are going off, right, or negative, but ignore things that are positive like, oh, that's nice, right? Like, we need to pay attention to the bridges as much as we pay attention to people burning down those bridges. And that'll be a beginning to me of how people change the ideology of how they post.
So I'm going to take a risk here and challenge the debate.
Do it.
And say that it's really impossible because the social media network create in-groups.
Sure.
And once you have an in-group, there's an out-group. And people feel they're diverse because they have hundreds of friends, not recognizing that curated news has created their friendship network and that they're really surrounded by people just like them.
Yeah.
So liking something that's positive is among people who already are likely to believe it's positive. Maybe it doesn't move the needle as far as some people might think.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that that's a way to start with our friends, right? Right, our own in-groups. Because if we don't pay attention to our own in-groups, who's going to? You know, and it's a lot like was expressed earlier. Like part of the vigilance is not just paying attention to people outside of our groups, but it's to notice that these things exist inside our groups as well. Like I'm not sure there is an in-group, out-group. I agree with you. I don't know that there's a way to reach out-groups unless you actively try to seek out-groups, right? Now, a lot of white supremacist groups using social media, like the KKK, who the FBI no longer branded a terrorist organization, and they now brand themselves as a political affiliation, right? Have on their webpage, and Sumar and I were talking about this the other day for one of her speeches, like, hey, if you want to talk to us, feel free to call us up. If you're black, that's okay too. We just want to talk, right? Like, so the use of social media to create an innocence in messages, like to make it more innocuous, I think is also part of the problem of building bridges, right? Because what do those bridges really look like? Can I call the KKK and be like, you want to get coffee? Show black people aren't that crappy? You know, that's just not going to happen.
I think one of the ways to build those bridges is to simply abandon social media. You know, I had an experience the other day. Where I got a critical email from someone who I know very well, and I responded with on one email, and then she responded back, and then I picked up the phone. Because I figure after one email back and forth, it's time to talk with someone. And I can't tell you how many times, maybe you guys have had the same experience, where I start typing an email and I thought, wait a minute, I'm not even typing in all caps, but it'll probably be received the wrong way. And so I delete the email and just pick up the phone.
What he said.
Yeah, cosign.
So how do you think that political polarization has played into the apparent resurrection of white separatist movements?
I just want to say one thing. It's not a resurrection.
Yes. Can somebody say that?
Yeah. It's just, they've always been there. It's just, we live in this bubble of, in urban settings especially, where you know, it's okay and we're like all diverse and everybody gets along, and you just go a few miles outside of town and it's all, you know, and so it isn't a resurrection. After Charlottesville, after Trump, who was emboldened all this, then suddenly there was like, where are these people coming from? I can't believe there's that many neo-Nazis out on campuses. Did they spring up like mushrooms? No. They were there. The belief system is there. It's just that the media has suddenly decided that it's a crisis now. And I worry in 4 years when they impeach Trump or get rid of him or whatever, are we going to go back to thinking that was just a fluke?
You know, it's a normalization also, and anecdotally, I can tell you that it's escalated significantly. You know, the ADL came out with a report that maybe some of you saw last month that talked about the incredible increase in anti-Semitic events. And while Rice is a wonderful little bubble of nothing happening here, 5 miles away at the University of Houston, I can tell you just beginning at the beginning of this year, a couple months ago, the number of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic incidents on campus has exploded in a way that I haven't seen in almost 2 decades.
They did throw a swastika on the Berlin Wall, by the way. At Weiss
Right. That's right. No, there were a few swastikas here last year.
Yeah. So, you know,
absolutely.
I think it's not the bubble we love it to be. But
Yeah.
I do think we have to be careful with the idea of resurrection. I think you all need to be better read about how immortal racism has been and how immortal it is likely to be. It's died so many times that we buried it, and then it, like a zombie, it pops right back up, and people are surprised. And I'm surprised when people are surprised. As a race scholar, I've read enough to know this is a long-term problem. A president does not solve it. On the night Barack Obama got elected, a family member called and said, "Oh boy, what are you going to study now?" And I said, for a moment, I paused and said, I think I'll find something to study. So I think there's a naivete about the degree to which this is a new thing. And if you read really carefully the history of the United States, this isn't new. It's different, but it's not new in the sense that these kind of ideologies have been around forever.
If anything, now with the nationalism in Europe, it's reached a crescendo level that we haven't seen since, well, I don't think ever, because I mean, even in World War II, it was concentrated in Europe, and now we're getting nationalism all over the world at the same time. So that's really scary.
And I think we tend to focus on radical things. Charlottesville gets attention. We focus on that. But white supremacy is as ordinary as oxygen. Until it's not there, you might not notice it, but every day of every minute, it's there. I tell people when I teach that when I pull out a dollar bill and I remind them, as a descendant of a slave owner, this dollar bill is made from cotton, and on it is the face of a slave owner. It's there, it's foundational. So the idea that it's new or resurrected is not a very wise and historically informed perspective.
And it's in our conversations all the time. Like, how many people have said things like rule of thumb, not knowing what it means? You know, how many times have we said gyp someone, not knowing what it means? Like, renege. Renege on something, right? All of those come from a framework of institutionalized racism, and if you don't know what they mean before you use them again, please, please look them up. There are phrases that we use every day and are seemingly innocuous, but the reality is they're part of the racist structure that we cannot avoid. And we, whether we know it or not, are helping perpetuate it.
So I guess moving into some of the audience questions, this follows up nicely actually. The question is, how do you engage or I guess combat the propaganda that you were talking about when there's an increasing push in anti-intellectualism within this movement? So you have facts, but your facts don't matter ideology.
Well, you know, fake news, right? I mean, people ultimately will choose to filter among all the information they have out there and keep the things that they're comfortable with that fulfill some sort of excuse or some sort of belief system that they want to reinforce. So they'll pick and choose. We all do that. And I mean, we all have selective bias toward what comes in, right? And the problem with somebody who has a bias on racial or ethnic levels against somebody else is going to filter the stuff in. So the only thing I can say, it's very difficult, but having educational campaigns that show how we are all, you know, focusing on the similarities and the connection between all of us as human beings and pushing that out. And having programs on the high school level where people interact and express and feel safe to express how they feel. But I mean, ultimately it's very difficult because we all filter through our own personal, you know, bias system, pretty much everything. It doesn't have to be, you know, serious issues, but we just do that all the time as human beings. So.
And I would say, while you don't have an obligation to teach each other, okay, the reality is that we have to, and we have to do so with honesty and specificity, right? Saying you hurt my feelings in no way teaches people exactly what was said that you found problematic. But if you are going to address that, you have to be open to a response, and that response just can't be in your mind that this is a bad person. Like, we do things all the time that are quote-unquote accidentally racist or sexist, you know. And if we can't confront them in ourselves, perhaps we should think about how we talk to other people about them, okay? It can't be, I can't believe you said that. It needs to be something more like, hey, remember, when we had this conversation, you said this specific thing. What were you thinking when you said that? Like, what was your perspective? Could you help me understand your positionality, right?
And just a segue, like taking, for example, the line that I was fed that, you know, immigrants are bad and they're coming to say whatever, that kind of, when I became deprogrammed, when I was speaking with the activist who helped me filter through, she was like, well, okay, so give me your best shot. Give me your best argument. So I would say the line that I was taught. And then she said, well, no, look at the demographics and the factors. Like, we need immigrants to come in because, like, there's, you know, the population needs the tax and the money in order to. So it was like actually realizing that some of the lines that I knew were very simplistic and they weren't thought out. But if she hadn't done that, I would have still continued to believe that, right? Or if she had come and punched me out and left, that would not help either. So figuring out what is your beef. Like, people now, because they're afraid of backlash, so they won't say it. But if you break it down to what are you really afraid of, it comes down to, I'm afraid I'm going to lose something. I'm afraid somehow that piece of the pie, because the rich are getting richer, and we're all like, there's a lot more competition for jobs than in my professor's time. You know, there's a competition for everything. And it's like you cling to some, like, I don't want to lose my piece of the pie, and they're going to take it. So it's just kind of like creating the bridging and connection between the fact that we all want the same thing. So we don't have to be in competition with each other. Got to find a way to encourage and enhance each other.
Yeah, realizing everybody does not have the same perspective.
Yeah.
And not being willing to not shut that perspective out.
Yeah.
So many people, I heard young people say, as soon as I heard my friend voted for Trump, I unfriended them, or whatever the case.
Yeah.
That was the moment when you should have asked them.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's that about?
Why?
I want to talk about that. I want to understand your perspective. I never forget hearing, I think it was a Saturday Night Live skit where Tom Hanks was playing Black Jeopardy or something like that. And he was juxtaposed to two black people on the panel, and he was playing the angry white male who was a Trump supporter, and his answers were lining up with the black answers, like, yeah, you can't trust the system, and da-da-da. And you realize, wait, there's some things that the people in the center of the country who overwhelmingly supported Trump are echoing that other groups have said. And so there's that moment when you can find empathy.
Yep.
You know, I'm sorry to be the cynical voice, but but I think a lot of this that we're talking about is pretty exceptional, because you have to have a relationship with someone in the first place to actually have that conversation, and to have someone who might even listen to you. You know, so a lot of things that I hear are about trying to talk to those people who aren't so dogmatic on one side or the other, you know, and finding those opportunities. And certainly the examples you guys were giving were conversations with people who you know and perhaps respect you on some level, with whom you have a relationship that you can build that further conversation on.
But let's say it's in class, right? Like, let's say you're talking to somebody in class, and your response is intended to try to change this mindset. Even if you can't change this one, who you're speaking to, you still have other people listening to what you're trying to say. And I think that that can have impact as well, right?
Sure.
Like the person that they were trying to sway, maybe they won't, now that they hear this other perspective. But I agree, they have to be in the vicinity some kind of way, right?
And I don't want to be the wet blanket, but I will say that conversations and empathy and fact-checking are all important. But white supremacy is about a material reality. It's about a material reality, right? So since 1950, the infant mortality rate for blacks and whites has diverged. Since 1950, it's not getting better for infants born, black infants born. So there's a material reality around wealth and its concentration and its lack of the disparities we see in incarceration and in wealth, and those things are part of what we have to attack as well, in addition to having conversations with people we like to influence.
Access, like a lot of access is denied to a lot of different things.
So this question is specifically for Elisa. It's about, the question is, would you have stayed in the Heritage Fund in the event that you were not, you did not start to identify with the queer community?
It's difficult. I would have left, because there were the violence, the beatings in the street, there were a lot of attacks. And I realized it was like, if anybody knows about the history of the IRA and Sinn Féin, like there's this political idea, political facade that we're just about policy and change, but the weapons, it made me feel like it was something that I didn't sign up for. Like, say I signed up for Sinn Féin but not the IRA component, right? So it was kind of like, and I realized that I was being manipulated and used, and I was being, to put it bluntly, people were trying to force me to sleep with them as well because I was the only one who wasn't dating, and they said, that doesn't look right, and you have to have Aryan baby. So there was a lot of personal issues that I had, questions I had about the leadership and how they were going, identifying with the queer community. So it's just a lot of factors. Even being female was you know, I worry about the white males who don't have any, who aren't identifying with any victimized minorities. Like it just, I don't know how you reach them. It's a lot harder. Maybe reaching them on the socioeconomic level and explaining to them that they don't have to hate others because, you know, they're gonna lose this bubble world that they think they have. You know, it's a lot harder to reach white supremacists who are deep down. And what often happens is men who leave the movements usually are men who have babies with a woman, and then they have a child, and then they look at that child. And I've heard this story from various formers who realize then, do I want my kid to go to those Klan rallies and hear all the horrible things that are being said? I don't think I want that. And that's when a lot of, like, I think at least 4 or 5 guys, that was their stories, is having that child. And thinking of someone else. Because if it was just up to them, who knows, they probably would have stayed. And sometimes also getting busted, going to jail, realizing that your friends are not your friends, and that's also like another way that people leave. Yeah.
So there's been a lot of questions about free speech in the context of this conversation. So your thoughts?
I said it when I made my presentation. I believe in free speech theoretically, but not really. I think you've got to get rid of the propaganda, and you got to do it fast. If it's on the internet, somebody will use it to radicalize themselves. The memes, the fake stories. Like, I was influenced by Fred Leuchter's fake Auschwitz. Some guy who said he was a chemist. He went to Auschwitz, he did swabs, apparently there was no gas. That was all fake, but I fell for that. That kind of material needs to be removed. So no hate books. I was able to remove the Turner Diaries and a couple other books from online bookstores in Canada. If you know, the Turner Diaries is the book, the Bible, basically, that Timothy McVeigh used to radicalize himself before Oklahoma City. So that book is still out there for the next guy and the next guy to read it and to be informed of the same material that McVeigh had. So get rid of all of that. And yes, free speech, as long as somebody's free speech doesn't impede upon somebody else's right to live, then I'm cool with that.
I totally disagree. If you want to learn more about my perspective, I teach common law in the fall. You're welcome to take it and we talk about this. But to be succinct, anything that we can ban means we can't use, right? And Burke with Hitler's Battle made it very, very clear that Hitler wrote his manifesto a long time before we saw any of this go down, right? But people like to ignore it. They like to edit it. They like to think, you know, especially from an American perspective, oh, this won't possibly happen in this way, right? So when I look at things that are this radical propaganda, a lot of what we see with the propaganda is not only people that it's influencing, but we have to know what's out there to combat it, right? We're never going to be able to see and stop everything, right? But if we operate in a bubble of, oh, great, we got rid of it all, I mean, you're never going to be able to really understand what is going on to this extent.
I've heard that argument, though, used for why Stormfront wasn't shut down for years. They said, well, that's how half the people in Stormfront are FBI agents monitoring. And yeah, but the other half are like Anders Breivik from Norway was a Stormfront member, and he did the Utoya Island shooting. So the point is, and it's probably the USA versus Canada, because we're a lot more strict on
definitely.
that. But I'm also afraid that, yeah, it's available for us as academics and activists to see it, but it's also available for them. So it's kind of like a risk factor analysis of, shouldn't you just remove it so it's not available to them versus informing ourselves of what's happening?
But the word terrorism, especially in the United States, is inherently racist, okay? We're not going to start to ban white groups that are expressing political opinions, right? Yeah. We're going to use this to crack down on peaceful African groups, Muslim groups, like different groups that we consistently use the law to subjugate, right? So who would really be banned with this whole hate speech anti-American propaganda. If we're not even condemning the KKK and we're allowing them to exist as a political organization, their propaganda then is totally protected under political scrutiny. However, you have other peaceful groups like the BSA on campus, and they say, hey, we're having a meeting and we're gonna have this. It's like, the black people are meeting. Well, how many of them are getting together? Well, you know, this is a predominantly white campus. There may be anger there. Perhaps we should begin to monitor this, right?
Oh, yeah, and exactly. And just one other thing that I want to say is be careful of anybody in any kind of student organization who's telling you to kind of do stuff, because as I've seen from my experience, sometimes there are people who are inciting violence. So be careful of those people. There might be law enforcement, or what happened with the Heritage Fair. I'm not saying they're undercover agents trying to stir shit up, but it can happen. So don't fall for the easy thing.
But I think that part of it also is remembering that while we're not in the business of limiting speech, neither are we obligated to facilitate speech.
Sure. Except for free speech zones, but sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In conclusion, we have one more question. So how do white communities in particular factor into this conversation? And then tangential to that, how does interracial solidarity play into this conversation?
So I chuckled when you first said that, because one of the things that the Jewish community feels is that it's easy for most of us who are from an Ashkenazi background in Eastern Europe to pass as white. I can take off my kippah, go to the H-E-B, and walking down the aisle, people don't say, oh, look, there's a Jew. So passing in most of the American Jewish community is a pretty easy thing. And I think that that's something that in the past couple of years, the Jewish community has become really heightened to and aware of in a very different way than before.
So the classic line that I hear is, well, I never owned slaves. It's not my deal. And I just read a book called White Rage by Carol Anderson that I recommend all of you read. And she talks about the degree to which that's absolutely true. But there's a moral and social responsibility, the same way someone comes into office, a political office, they inherit the problems their forebears made in that office. So I think we need to have a reckoning. We need to have a reckoning with what has been done in the past. And we need whites to step forward to be allies. And I often hear white allies say, I can't wait to start this group in my all-white church. And I think that's a part of the problem. You need to join that group at that all-black church. Mm-hmm. The allyship requires being uncomfortable sometimes in a safe space, and recognizing and reckoning with the history that has put us at the place we're at today.
And I think that denies that we all, if you're in America, participate in locations that were built on the backs of slavery. Like that's just what it is. Like, we can't avoid it, and if we don't acknowledge it, we aren't really looking at how so many structures, from our Capitol buildings to our universities, were actually built. Right? So saying I didn't own slaves does not equate to I didn't benefit from slavery. Right? And I think that's an important distinction.
All right. Thank you to our panelists. So I know you guys are probably aware there's a business card size toolkit located within your programs. And this is in no way meant to be a comprehensive solution, because if we knew how to solve for white supremacy or white extremist radicalization, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, right? But we thought that we offer just, I guess, a starting place for conversations and for thinking and for combating these things in your everyday life. So if you can see, there's an acronym, STOP. It's convenient, like you gotta stop white supremacy. Yeah, this is no creative genius, nothing. I get nothing for that. No credit. Right?
Stop.
Yeah. Thanks. Of course, it's business college. So, as being supporting others, this is also very much in the vein of Elisa's presentation and a lot of the panelists' answers and conversation today. So, S stands for just obviously support others. T, build trust. O, fight oppression. And P, promote social justice. Each and every one of us in this room have a responsibility to fight white supremacy because it affects each and every one of us in this room, whether it affects you directly, whether it affects you physically. Like Dr. Brown said, there's a force of mutuality that we have in this room. We can't escape it. It's beyond all of us. But we do have a responsibility to fight that within our everyday life and our everyday interactions. So I want you guys to leave this panel knowing that you have the tools and that you have differences in perspective on this issue, and that you, like everyone sitting beside you, have a responsibility in dealing with these issues moving forward. So take this toolkit, apply it to your everyday life, use it. And thank you for coming to our panel, you guys.